From the Oregon State University's Extension Service, you are listening to In the Woods with the Forestry and Natural Resources Program. This podcast aims to share the voices of researchers, land managers, and members of the public interested in telling the story of how woodlands provide more than just trees. They provide interconnectedness that is essential to your daily life. Stick around to discover a new topic related to forests on each episode. Welcome back to another episode of In the Woods. I'm your host, Lauren Grand, Assistant Professor of Practice and Extension Agent in Oregon State University's College of Forestry. Today's topic is wildlife. Our guest today is Thomas Stokely. Thomas is a forester and ecologist with OSU Extension Service and has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Missouri and a master's and PhD in forest and wildlife ecology from the Oregon State University's College of Forestry. As the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent serving Central Oregon, Thomas's role is to provide science-based education to communities on the management and conservation of forests and the wildlife they support. He provides technical support to help inform land management decisions at local and regional levels with a focus on cross-boundary partnerships and attaining a balance between economical, ecological, and societal values. Welcome, Thomas. We're really glad to have you. So today, Thomas and I are going to be talking about wildlife. And just so that we're all on the same page, Thomas, can you first define what wildlife is for us?
So many folks think about furry or feathered creatures when they talk about wildlife, but technically wildlife are any non-domesticated creature that exists out there in nature. Generally speaking, though, we often designate the term wildlife to include animals, typically vertebrate animals like mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. But really, insects and other arthropods are wildlife too. Even bacteria and fungi can be considered wildlife as they're part of ecosystems. So, in forestry, when we talk about wildlife, we're typically thinking about mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, not necessarily insects, but technically speaking, any non-domesticated creature.
Wow, that's a broader spectrum than I was expecting you to say. So lots of things to think about when we're talking about wildlife. But a lot of people want to know, how do wildlife live? So can you give us a little bit of a background of what wildlife habitat is?
So yeah, that's kind of the hardest part for me whenever I think about wildlife habitat, because really habitat is species specific. And habitat's really the resources and conditions that exist in a given area that an animal occupies or an organism occupies. So we often talk about what is suitable habitat, and suitable habitat means that those given resources will allow that species or those individual organisms to survive and also reproduce. So that's really why it's species specific, because habitat are those resources that a given organism uses to survive and reproduce, not just an overarching term for a given area. But we also talk about habitat associations. So mixed conifer forest, for instance, you might think of a certain species like the orange crown warbler using these broadleaf habitats. So associations, habitat association is typically what we talk about more broadly when we speak about wildlife habitat. So what is a species associated with? So, a given butterfly might be associated with a meadow, alpine meadow, or a woodpecker will be associated with dead wood in a forest. So broadly speaking, wildlife habitat are all those resources that a given species needs to survive and reproduce. And those resources, we have this broad categorization of them to include food, water, cover, and space. And so the food and water, obviously everything needs food and water to survive and reproduce. But those cover resources are really important for a variety of species. So it could be a nesting cover for a songbird. It could be denning cover for a small mammal or a bear. It could be thermal cover for mule deer during the winter time, where they need to stay warm under the closed canopy of a dense forest, or stay cool under the closed canopy during the summer. And then space is really critical. and different species use space differently. So you might have a given beetle that will only occupy a few square meters of a forest versus something like a mule deer will occupy, they'll travel very long distances, requiring a variety of different habitat types during their life cycle. So, and the cover really depends on the available resources for that given organism. So if there's a whole lot of resources, they might not need to travel as far to attain those resources. Versus if, like say in a more limited environment, like a dry forest, mule deer will occupy a much larger area than, say, a black-tailed deer on the west side, which has more forage resources available, so they don't have to travel as far to get those forage plants.
So it's a really interesting concept you bring up. A lot of people talk about creating more wildlife habitat, but like you said, wildlife habitat for what? It's really species specific. So I think that's really important to think about, and that we can always start thinking about as we think about how forests are managed for different objectives. I hear this word niche come up a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what the difference between habitat and niche is?
Yeah, so, habitat, we typically think of the physical environment that a given organism lives in. And a niche is really the range of conditions that a species will exist, with no two species being able to occupy the same niche at the same time and space. So that basically it's very theoretical when we talk about a niche, and it also involves the relative role an organism has in the environment. And, for instance, pileated woodpecker are cavity excavators. And so they perform the role of, chiseling away at the bark and creating these cavities. And then that ends up, that's the role of that organism. But also we have to think about the realized niche. We call it a realized niche, which is kind of funny to think about, but essentially the niche has to account for interactions with other species. So if you have a species that's going to be competing with another species, or you have a predator in a given area, that's really going to limit that whole niche breadth, the range of conditions that a given organism can live in. Because if they're going into an area that seems like suitable habitat, but there's a predator there that precludes them from surviving, then it's not really suitable anymore. So that when we talk about niches, we have to think about competition and predation and interactions with other species, because no single species or multiple species can't really occupy the same niche in the same time and space due to competition excluding one another. So I guess I get kind of confused when we talk about niche and habitat a lot. I think a lot of people use them interchangeably, and niche is a lot more theoretical. It's sort of a range of conditions that a species might exist in, whereas habitat would be those specific locations that organism is occupying. And, really, for instance, like if the habitat is suitable and a given organism has to travel really far to find that suitable habitat, and then once they get there, there's a competitor or there's a predator, it's not necessarily suitable habitat for them. So a niche kind of is a lot more theoretical, and habitat's a little bit more tangible. And then the niche also sort of accounts for the role that organism plays in the environment.
Thanks for clearing that up. It's sorry, were you going to say something else?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right. So now we've covered sort of what wildlife is and what habitat is. So since this is a podcast about forests, can you talk to us a little bit more about if maybe there's a sweet spot for when forests provide the best habitat for wildlife?
Yeah, that's another it depends kind of answers. I would say not really, because it's species specific. So if we think about a given forest that burns down, for instance, in a wildfire, or is harvested during, a clear cutting operation over on the west side, there's a whole sort of successional trajectory that forest takes on, going through this early successional stage where You get a lot of forbs and shrubs filling in after that big disturbance, followed by the trees filling in, and to where they start to close canopy and limit the understory development. And then over time, as those trees mature, the forest starts to open up again, where you have some trees that are just old and decadent dying, creating canopy gaps and opening light resources and nutrients in the understory, allowing that flush of understory vegetation again. So when it comes to wildlife species, it really depends on what their suitable habitat is and what their associations are. During the early successional stage, that flush of resources in the understory, all the forage being produced, all the nesting habitat, really attracts a variety of different wildlife species, from deer and elk to migratory songbirds that occupy those broadleaf habitats here in Oregon. And we often characterize that early successional stage as being really diverse when it comes to not only plant life, but also wildlife and animal life. And as that forest closes in, the canopy closes, it's a little bit more limited to species that require closed canopy conditions. So the understory starts to become dark. There's less forage in the understory. But like, for instance, deer and elk that are a generalist species, meaning they can use a wide variety of different resources, they'll use those closed canopy conditions for thermal cover, for hiding cover from predators. There are certain birds that will occupy those closed canopy conditions, like the northern goshawk will occupy sort of dense, mature forests. And then once you get to that older, mature forest stage and the old growth stage, you get a lot of species start filling in again. And some species will require that old growth. They're associated primarily with old growth, like the northern spotted owl or flying squirrel. And typically we think of that early successional stage as being the most diverse when it comes to wildlife, but then also old growth are also quite diverse because of that diversification in the forest structure. So you got a lot of understory, some midstory, and then those dominant tree species, and a lot of different structures there for different species. So it really depends on the organism you're talking about in terms of sweet spots. But in terms of diversity, you kind of get a high diversity early on, and also later on, with that middle stage being a little less diverse and more suitable for lower variety of species.
Great. So there's a lot of forests that we have in Oregon that are sort of in that mid range where maybe diversity isn't as high as the edges. What are some characteristics that a landowner or somebody who manages forests could include when managing to be able to increase some of that diversity?
Yeah, so in the forestry / wildlife world, there's sort of these main characteristics we talk about when we talk about things that we can manipulate through silvicultural practices that will promote habitat resources for different species. And broadly speaking, those include the vertical structure, meaning the bottom of the forest all the way up to the top. So your understory, your midstory, your overstory species. That's an example of vertical structure. So there are these relationships where if you have more diverse vertical structure, so more canopy layering, you can fit in more bird species, for instance. And so creating that vertical structural complexity can benefit a variety of different wildlife species because you have some understory associated species, midstory and overstory associated species. Then along those lines, we also have horizontal structure, which is, think of it as a plane as you look across the forest. And that would include, how many trees per acre you have. Are there openings? Are there dense patches of forest? And so similar to vertical structure, increasing horizontal structural complexity can benefit a wide variety of species because you can have openings that would serve as foraging habitat for, say, deer and elk, as well as these dense cover patches that different critters can use for hiding or nesting cover. And within that, we also want to include the vegetation composition. So what species are there? Are there berry producing shrubs, for instance, in the understory? Do you have, mature like hemlock and an old growth? And so we really have to think about what types of plant species are there, because different wildlife species will use different plants differently. And then we don't have to just think about the live vegetation, but also the dead ones. And standing deadwood, otherwise known as snags, and also fallen deadwood, otherwise known as just down logs, are really important for a variety of different species. And a lot of species will use that coarse wood habitat throughout their life cycle. So for a snag, that might be really important foraging habitat for a woodpecker or nesting habitat for a bluebird. And then the fallen deadwood can be really critical for species that need to stay moist during the summertime, like amphibians, will sort of burrow into that coarse wood. Black bears will den underneath large dead down logs. And so we really need to think also about the dead tree components as much as we think about the live tree components when managing a forest for wildlife.
Yeah, I hear that from all of my wildlife biologist friends, is that we need more dead wood everywhere.
That's a kind of, it depends, as well, because it's not just, the amount of dead wood, but what the dead wood is. Coarse dead wood certainly is missing in a lot of areas where we have historical logging practices that had limited the amount of large diameter trees that would have ended up dying and becoming those coarse wood habitats. And also there's this whole idea of fire risk as well. We don't want to just have tons of accumulation of dead wood in the understory, specifically here on the east side forest, because in the east side, we'd have had more frequent fire that would have limited the accumulation of that dead wood, specifically the fine dead wood. If you think about building a fire when you're out camping, you don't just try to put a flame to a big round, big log and expect it to burn. You need a lot of fine wood as well. And so that can also pose a risk, because we don't necessarily want to have these forests that are just chock full of fuels. So there's a balance that really needs to be attained there when it comes to reducing fuels while maintaining that deadwood component and maintaining that diversity, vertical and horizontal structural diversity in the forest for promoting wildlife. And there are many ways that we can do that, and focusing on those main elements while reducing fuel loading is important here on the east side. On the west side, those forests are a lot more characterized by just dense vegetation. So it really depends on where you're at in the landscape when we're talking about these different resources.
Okay, that's great. So making sure that we have the right dead wood. Okay, so a lot of the properties that I've sort of mentioned here in Oregon are managed on a parcel by parcel basis or ownership by ownership. And how does that affect wildlife and their habitat characteristics as they move around throughout their range?
Yeah, this can be a really big issue in certain areas, and it relates to that space component that I talked about earlier when it comes to those habitat resources and animals needing space. So connectivity is one big one. And whenever it comes to highly fragmented landscapes where there's a variety of different ownerships, that can limit, for instance, the dispersal of, say, a flying squirrel that, their young should, whenever they're born, the young will then disperse on to different areas. But if they're cut off from that mature forest that's, 30, 40 miles away, and there's an area where they don't have tree cover, where they don't have those structures to fly and travel from tree to tree. When I say fly, glide from tree to tree, it can really limit the movement and dispersal of those organisms. And that has implications for not only the population, but genetic diversity, which we're finding more and more is really important to sustaining wildlife populations into the future. And so really it's important for folks to be working together when it comes to land ownership, managing in a way that they can help to increase that connectivity. So, but also, it also presents opportunities as well, because if, a given landowner notices that there's certain resources missing in the landscape, like that coarse deadwood component, they might be able to provide that on their property and provide that as a source habitat for species, depending on the acreage of that land. But fragmentation is a big one. And for certain species, though, like say deer and elk that are generalist species, those edgy areas, those what we call edge habitats, those can be really important for them, because they have their openings where an area was harvested. They have, their closed canopy conditions and folks' parcels that, don't necessarily harvest their trees like that, through regenerative harvesting. So it can present opportunities for generalist species, but it can really limit specialist species that require especially old growth conditions. Or, in the case of an area where there's no openings, that can limit the forage production and limit that broadleaf component of the forest. It's really important for a variety of songbird species.
Okay, let's talk about management. So we talked a little bit about what forest characteristics can influence wildlife populations. What are some ways that we can enhance these characteristics during certain management activities? So let's say someone is doing a clear-cut harvest. What are some things they can do to try to benefit as many wildlife species as possible?
I'm going to first add to that previous point, and talking about the space aspect of things. It's really important to know what's in the landscape, what's already there, what might be missing. And also think about the species that you're wanting to manage for. If a given plot of land is too small, even though you have, say, like some old growth trees on your property, if that parcel of land is too small, it might not be suitable for a species like flying squirrel if it's too small. So, going on to the next question, really important to know what the historical conditions were of the forest, what's available in the landscape, what might be missing, and how much connectivity there is. So during, like, say, clear cutting operations, if you're wanting to promote diversity to wildlife species, retaining live trees can be important, especially retaining snags, so that dead standing wood, and keeping/creating coarse wood can really present an opportunity for different species. And then if there is, if the management objective is to remove the logs for economic purposes, landowners can also create these habitat wood piles, or what some folks call biodens, where they use sort of the finer, smaller diameter logs, and you stack them sort of like Lincoln logs, cross-hatch stack them, and then cover those with fine materials and as a roof, and that can provide space for different critters to den or nest within those wood piles. So if you're wanting to do a clear-cut harvest operation, it can be pretty critical not to just burn every single slash pile you have, but intentionally create them in a way that can provide cover for different species, and disperse that coarse wood component in a way that facilitates movement of animals throughout that harvested area. So, you don't want to just have a very large opening with one wood pile in the middle of it, because, a given rodent or bird might not necessarily be able to get there in the case that a predator is seeking them out. So having, dispersal of those resources throughout a harvest unit can be pretty critical for the movement of creatures. And, when we talk about reforestation, oftentimes vegetation management is a primary objective, is to reduce the amount of competition so that you can get your trees to grow as fast as possible. But we've done some recent research, actually, that's actually being published. It's in production right now about ecosystem services and biodiversity in these managed forests that essentially allowing some of that vegetation to retaining some of that vegetation, whether it's a skip in your herbicide treatment or intentionally planting forage species in certain areas. But retaining patches of native vegetation can be quite critical. So you don't necessarily just want a homogeneous stand of Douglas fir. Allowing some of those broadleaf species to regenerate is really important. And some work from Tana Ellis and Matthew Betts found that you don't even need a whole lot of it to promote songbirds, diversity of songbirds. Really only 10% of these areas, if you have 10% broadleaf cover, that can be quite beneficial. There's sort of a threshold at over 10%, or up to 10%, you have great increases in songbird abundance and diversity. So, that's more for regeneration harvests like clear cuts. And when we're talking about thinning, we also, if we want to promote wildlife species, whether it's thinning for commercial purposes, thinning to reduce fuels, you can think about variable density thinning or variable retention harvests, where you thin at different densities so that you have some dense patches, you have some that are fairly evenly thinned out, and then openings as well. And those openings can promote that forage for, say, deer and elk, or the broadleaf component for neotropical songbirds. And during those thinning operations, it's a really good time to start thinking about creating snags, dropping trees to promote that down coarse wood, and really, trying to maintain what we call these biological legacies, these old trees that have been there for a while. Keeping them around can be quite critical in both clear cutting and thinning operations. And it's really important because some species are associated with that coarse wood component, but some of those trees that are really old biological legacies aren't really, it's not really financially feasible to remove them. And so, those, you can think of those like real gnarly, wolfy looking trees, and keeping them in those harvest units can be quite beneficial for different species. But at the minimum, really, following the Forest Practices Act rules for retaining, live trees and snags, and also riparian zone management, where you have your riparian buffers, and at the bare minimum follow the Oregon Forest Practices Act. But if you retain more of that riparian vegetation, a lot of wildlife use those riparian zones as travel corridors. So the more you have that vegetated, the more you have extreme cooling, you have cover for species that are seeking out water. If they're very exposed, they might not go to that water because it might be a risk for predation. So retaining, different levels of vegetation along those riparian corridors can be pretty important for the species that use them. And not to mention inputs of dead wood into the stream can be quite critical in those riparian zones.
Okay, well, I think we've got some good information now about what wildlife are and their habitat, and some ways to benefit their habitat during management practices. Can you offer some resources for people about how they can find out about what species might be in certain forests, or if they own property, what species might be on their property?
Yeah, you can contact your local Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife biologist. We've got wildlife biologists distributed all throughout the state. So that would be a good first place to give them a ring, ask them what they might find in their properties. Not to put in a plug for OSU Extension, but you can contact your extension forester. I know, Lauren, you know quite a bit about wildlife, so you'd be a good resource for the folks there in Lane County. But there's a wide variety of information. It's a little overwhelming at times, but I would suggest, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife would be a good first start. And then you can get just local guides to see, what a species is typically associated with. So there's a variety of different bird guides, reptile, amphibian guides, and, just get some field books and take a walk out in the forest and start thinking about what resources you have on your property and what might be associated with those areas.
Yeah, those are great resources. One of my favorite resources that I learned about recently was the Biodiversity Index that the Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon Woodland Explorer have together, to where you can just put in a location and it'll actually give you a list of some of the potential species that might be out there. It's not a guarantee. You have to do some of that, field book walking around, but that's another resource that I find useful.
Yeah, the Oregon Explorer, I think, is a really good resource, and ODFW is also coming up with a list of different species that you might find around in the state. So they've got, what the species is and what they're typically associated with. But yeah, the Oregon Explorer is a really great resource, especially for those habitat associations.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us and talking about wildlife. Before we come to a close, I have a few questions that I like to ask all of my guests. And the first one's a real...
Can I go back?
Yeah.
It's great to contact different professionals around the area to learn about what might occupy your forest. But I'm a really big fan of game cameras, or what we call in the scientific community camera traps. So they're really awesome because you can set them out in your forest. They're passive. They sense infrared or heat and motion. And so if you set them a little bit up high around breast height, you might be able to capture some of your larger mammals like deer and elk. If you set them lower down to the ground, around 1 to 2 feet off the ground, you'll be able to pick up rodents and other smaller animals. And then looking for tracks, go find a muddy area or an area down by a stream, and you can look for animal tracks and use a field guide to identify those tracks. Look for their scat or their poo, if you want to really get that deep into it. And also, I'm not really a professional birder by any means, but I certainly love to listen for them and learn about them. So that's a really easy way to find out what's on your property, is get a bird book. And, there's the Cornell Bird Ornithology Institute, which is really great for helping to identify different birds. And iNaturalist as well is a really great resource to find out what's in your area, because you can find other folks that have documented different species. But going out in the woods, exploring and trying to find out what's there, I think is the best way. And there's a lot of critters you're not going to see. That's the beauty of it, is, might need some camera traps to set up if you're really curious.
Well, I'll take any excuse to get out in the woods more. So thanks, Thomas. I'm really glad you were able to join us today and chat with me about one of my favorite topics in forest, which is wildlife. I have a few questions to ask you that I ask every one of our guests. And the first one's a real brain scratcher. What's your favorite tree?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I would say hardwood because it's a hard question, but lately, I've been a real big fan of Western larch. It's really fascinating to me. It's a deciduous conifer, so it loses its needles in the wintertime, and it can be very large, and they're fire adapted. And currently, due to the lack of fire, they need a little bit more protection and management to promote them throughout their range. They're becoming more limited due to that competition with other conifers that are less fire adapted, like your true fir species. So big fan of Western larch. And it's beautiful in the fall. It turns yellow. It's just, near and dear to my heart. Really like that one.
Yeah, gorgeous tree. I haven't had the pleasure of living near them yet, but maybe one day. Okay, so Our second question is, what's the most interesting thing that you bring with you into the field, whether it's in your cruiser's vest or field kit?
Yeah, I guess any type of lens, really, whether it's like a hand lens to look at the very small things or binoculars, cameras, camera traps, anything with a lens, I think is really important for me when I go out in the woods. And again, like the camera traps, like I can't be out there 24 hours a day looking for creatures. So setting them up in a good location, you can learn a lot about what's going on in your property. And then, in terms of like getting down to the really fine things, the hand lens is really cool. It's a whole different world once you look deep into it. And the binoculars, that's pretty obvious one for anyone that's into birding or hunting, and how much you see whenever you're able to zoom in.
Yeah, surprisingly, I just started bringing a pair of binoculars with me, and I took way too long to get there. I'm glad I carry them now. So our last question has to do with resources. I know you offered a lot of resources already, but is there anything else or anything in addition that you haven't mentioned yet that you would recommend to our listeners if they're interested in diving a little deeper into wildlife as they pertain to forests?
Yeah, again, I think it's great to go check out the Oregon Explorer app online. It's a really awesome resource to use to find out more information about the forest you have in a given area, what types of wildlife you might see. And, we could put in a plug for tree school. I know that y'all end up bringing a lot of wildlife biologists into those programs to talk about wildlife. Tree school is an excellent resource, and a lot of those are recorded online. And yeah, here in Eastern Oregon, we have this publication called Life on the Dry Side, and we typically will mention a little bit about wildlife there. But yeah, I would say, check out the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife webpage about different species, learning more about what might exist in your given forest. You could check out the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service webpage. They have a lot of good information about different organisms that are typically going to be more the organisms that are protected. And yeah, just get some books and get some field guides. These are always great resources. And yeah, we've actually got great resource that I'm now a part of. I'm really happy to be on board with this, is the Woodland Fish and Wildlife Group. And if you just Google Woodland Fish and Wildlife publications, we've got a whole set of publications about wildlife, varying from, we're working on one about small mammals now. They've got one on like pond turtles. You can find information on wildlife friendly fuels reductions in those articles. So it's woodlandfishandwildlife.com, and that's a pretty great resource. There's a whole team of us, a wide variety of different backgrounds, whether it's working for the state, feds, private. It's really great because I think it's quite objective, and we all are great at checking each other and making sure we're presenting objective information in those publications.
Those are some really great resources. Thank you so much for sharing them and for all of your great knowledge today, Thomas. We're really glad you could have joined us to talk about one of my favorite topics in forestry wildlife.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on our website, blogs.oregonstate.edu/inthewoodspodcast. We'd love to hear from you. Visit the Tell Us What You Think tab on our website to leave us a comment, suggest a guest or topic, or ask a question that can be featured in a future episode. And also give us your feedback by filling out our survey. In the Woods is produced by Lauren Grand, Carrie Berger, Jacob Putney, Stephen Fitzgerald, and Jason O'Brien, who are all members of the Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Team. This podcast is made possible by funding from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Music for In the Woods podcast was composed by Jeffrey Hino, and graphic design was created by Christina Freehoff. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we can't wait to talk to you again next month. Until then, what's in your woods?